Hi, David. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Guy. How are you this morning?
Well, I'm good. And this is one of our Did You See sessions. And we spoke just a little while ago over the Did You See for us was Did you see the General Lord Dannatt and his shock horror disapproval of an RAF initiation ceremony video that has come to light? And it was some relatively unpleasant viewing for a cadet or whatever that right word would be, being put through a hazing or a kind of an initiation process, and his reaction to that, and that triggered a question for us, which is, how do you stay in touch with the rest of an organization as you get to that rarefied air, and the longer you're in it, how do you stay connected to it? So that was our trigger, I think. That did you see, and why did we? Why, that's why it meant something to us.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the always, of course, you go cock up or conspiracy. Is this something that they're genuinely unaware of, or is this something where they're being a bit more, in Margaret Heffernan's terms, kind of willfully blind? Are they choosing not to ask too many careful questions in certain areas because they're a bit concerned about what the answer would be? So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is kind of cock up or conspiracy. But the other thing that comes to mind is there any reason why in the military, you might want people to go through tough initiation ceremonies and humiliating ones because they've somehow got to toughen up? And if we can tackle that one first, I mean, the thing that I find impressive. I once was able to do a leadership assessment of someone who had been a commanding officer of special forces in a previous job. And what was clear is that this idea that you don't fight for Queen and country, you fight for your mates, is really key. So, they do all kinds of things that bind the team together because they've got to depend on each other. But I suspect that what Lord Dannatt was reacting to was something which is not of that kind. It's not a kind of a, we're in this together, we're facing this adversity together. It's rather simply bullying, that someone in power is taking it out of someone without power. And I don't think there's any excuse for that, even in the military services. And I'm absolutely sure that any of the soldiers I've known, and I've not known that many, but the few that I have known, would agree that bullying is wrong under all circumstances.
Yes, it's a very interesting dynamic of it's part of the training program. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're doing it on purpose. Now, if we decide that the doing it on purpose is wrong and inappropriate, that's a separate thing. And this thing about banter, where does banter become bullying? Well, it depends on your mental state, the way that you have confidence in those kind of contexts. One person, there's just a situation at the moment with the Channel 4 SAS guy who, and somebody, I think his name is, I'm not great on those names, but he is being kind of brought to task by people, Channel 4, saying that he's been inappropriate on set. And his position is, well, hold on, this was 2 years ago. And actually, what was actually happening was it was the banter between me and my colleagues that was being observed by others. And they took affront or to the experience they had of observing us. So it wasn't even the fact that it was aimed at somebody, it was an indirect relationship to it.
Yes.
He said, and so, where do you stop?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting one of, you and I might be having a great laugh, but if somebody feels alienated, then we're a clique.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, for me, an awful lot of this is to do with power. It's to do with is there a power imbalance? If there is, then what looks like banter to the person in power may well look like bullying to the person without it. And I think that a lot of the accusations which women rightly throw at many men is that there is this kind of power issue. There's a kind of a dominance issue, and a lot of men need to know kind of the pecking order. Who's up, who's down, and yet team working, leadership in the 21st century is much more collaborative than that. So if we just go back to the notion of cock up or conspiracy, one of the things that comes to my mind is that your question initially was, how do people in the rarefied higher levels of organizations stay in touch with what's happening in reality on the ground? I think the first thing I'd say is that you've got to make sure that you're creating a culture in which people can tell you stuff. So that if they believe that you're out of touch, they can tell you that you're wearing no clothes, Mr. Emperor.
Yes, and so I think that's really, really important. This idea of that psychological safety, that ability to offer truth to power, is massive. And I think that at a cultural level is relevant for anything from us being able to give each other yes feedback. But where does innovation come from? Somebody being able to challenge a norm. Where does that resilience come from? My ability to say I'm tired, actually, and I don't know if I've got the energy for this project right now, or whatever it is. So yeah, that one single idea of the ability to offer the truth, or my truth as I'm experiencing it, whether or not it is the truth, and have conversations about it, is fascinating. And I'm just having a conversation with an organization right now where they go, we're a really nice group of leaders. And I've spoken to them, and they are. But I asked the question, when was the last time that you had unsolicited developmental feedback from a direct report? And the answer was, I don't know, nobody could remember. And I go, right, so let's just say you're all really as lovely as you seem. People have inbuilt kind of relationships with their fear around hierarchy. So it doesn't almost matter who's in the role. It's my ability to give the truth to a role that's senior to me. And have you done the groundwork on creating permissions, giving people a license to operate in that space? Because actually, they don't maybe inherently have it. So there's something about, I think, your point, that willful blindness, and it serves me to actually not have to talk about it, because I think it kind of helps. But also then there's even if I think it's great, have you put in place the processes or the culture to say it may not even be about us, it's people's relationship with power? And can we create that freedom for people to communicate in that space?
That's right. It was interesting. I for 20 years ran a consultancy, and I ran it jointly with my wife and two other colleagues who were the four people who actually led the organization. And Jenny was constantly telling me how hard it was for people to give me critical feedback. And I kept being really puzzled by it, because as God is my judge, I'm okay with it. I'd like them to tell me something I do well as well. But
sure.
If people are prepared to say, hey, this is good, but that needs fixing, I'm really okay with that. So why was it hard? And of course, the answers came down to really three things. I mean, one is that if I thought it was wrong, I'd argue. But again, that feels right. So having heard it, having understood it, if you think it's wrong, you need to be able to say, well, I'm not sure that's right, and say why. The second thing was that I was the boss, and I was in a sense therefore the ultimate court of appeal as well. But the third thing just happened to be a simple, I was 16 and a half stone bloke, so I've got a kind of presence. And if you're kind of half that size, everything says out of balance here, and even if I'm the most delightful negative feedback recipient on the planet, you've got to really take your courage in your hands to overcome those intrinsic barriers.
Yeah. And I think that's something that people don't, I think, really understand, which is at one level, it could just be a person's physical presence. It, coupled with the position they hold, coupled with et cetera, et cetera. So I think these things are really interesting. But I think the bit that is relevant to me is I watched a program some years ago, and I think it was called Back to the Floor, where the boss would go back to the floor. And I remember seeing, there were many examples of it, but I remember seeing one where it was a delivery company and the vans were going around and the CEO was in the van with them, and they had to keep stopping at a telephone box and ringing up the head office or the call center to find out what was next on the run or if they had a problem. And I remember this fella going, why haven't you got mobile phones? As in, he was so incredulous that the guy driving the van was like going, well, we have asked for them. You know? And he goes, yeah, but why haven't you got them? And the guy almost turned around and went, yeah, it's not because we haven't asked for them. And then he remembered him going back into the office and going, right, first things first, can we just give every van driver a phone? I'm not even going to ask how we got to that decision.
Yes.
But, you know, and it's, why does it take a kind of, it takes a show. It takes a kind of, oh, I'm sure it'll be great. I know my company really well. The chances are I'm going to shine. First half hour of show, holy schmoly, they haven't got mobile phones. And so it's the craft, it's the competence of, that Johari window, what's open, what's blind, what's hidden. Yes. At any one point, there must be something that is damaging to me, this organization, or our culture. And it's probably in a public space, and I'm just not privy to it because of the role that I'm in, the level I've got, or just my personal intensity or whatever it is. So what can I do to not be caught out? Well, and that's interesting, I think.
A good friend of mine was actually one of those bosses that went back to the shop floor.
Oh, right.
And so, yes, I'm very familiar with that program. And he did a really good job. Here's a guy who I won't mention his name, but here's a guy who I've got the utmost respect for. He's a guy who came from a fairly rough home, and here's a guy who developed the ability to be really tough on the outside, but he's absolutely human on the inside. He's a lovely human being, but with a kind of gruff exterior. And anyone who wants to give him feedback, if they're prepared to take their courage in their hands and do it, will find the most wonderfully receptive recipient of it. But you've got to overcome that. And I do think that it's important that we can create a culture in which people on both sides can have proper debates about things. But that's where power gets in the way. The other thing I would say is that trust is an issue as well. So, for example, I think we live in the 21st century in which we don't trust professionals or institutions anything like as much as we did, let's say, when I was a kid. People in authority were trusted and were respected, and all of this, and probably wrongly, but it was just part of a rather more deferential society. And I still remember quite a number of years ago now, talking to a doctor about terminal care. And I remember him saying, it's best you don't ask too many questions. And I was thinking, right. And of course, instantly your mind goes in two directions at once. Do I trust you? If it's my mum or my dad or my granny or do I trust you to do, as it were, the right thing? Or do I not? In which case, I've got to make sure that your freedom is restricted and curtailed. And I think that whole kind of breakdown of trust has a consequence that we've all got to live with, and that is that rules need to be explicit. There has to be the possibility of a challenge at every level, including in the courts. But I think that to some extent, we may also have lost something if you're dealing with people who genuinely are trustworthy and who care about you, that they will do the right thing, even if it costs them, and might even make themselves vulnerable to do the right thing, open to criticism, to do the right thing for you.
And, you said that phrase there, if prepared to take their courage in their hands. And I think there's something there about actually what is it that we can do as leaders that says they don't have to do that. They don't have to take their courage in their hands. That doesn't mean I just take, like we seem to see Hollywood these days, any form of criticism, and they just cancel somebody. And, we're not talking about I'm going to be at your beck and call with feedback, but actually, what would I have to do what would we have to do as an organization? So the military would be a classic example. You hear about it in the NHS where they say the surgeons in this one hospital, might not be everywhere else, but they were godlike status. Nobody could challenge them. You can't say a thing to them. Well, because when they're doing surgery, they don't want to debate. It's, in that moment in time, I am in charge. But can you say, actually, I think that, I'm a nurse. I've actually been doing this for 25 years or something. I may not have your skill, but I've ridden this horse before and I think you're wrong. Yeah. Can I do that? Can I say something? So how I think an individual and an organization can get the balance of you giving me feedback doesn't necessarily mean I accept it, but what's that ability for us to create that safety, that expectation, almost a sense of, I would be shamed to think that you couldn't or didn't give me. It's not your fault you didn't give me the feedback. It's my fault that I didn't seek it, create an environment that welcomes it. And if I've done all of that and then you don't give it, okay, that does sit with you. Yes. But we're a long way from a lot of organizations having that that's done right.
You know what's interesting is that where you've got a hierarchy which is visible on uniforms, so that the military, the disciplined services, and so on. Several things have come through my experience in those contexts. The first is that because organizations sometimes need to deal with crises, and in a crisis, it's often best to have a real clear, almost kind of dictatorial leader who says, do that, do that, do that, do that. And people just go off and do it and don't ask too many questions. I was working once with the police force in Hong Kong before the handover. And I was asking them, because they'd just been through the World Trade Organization conference in Hong Kong, at which the Korean farmers were kicking off on the streets. And I was I had 300 of the most senior Hong Kong police officers in the room. And one of them had his arm in plaster, and I thought, oh, I'll ask him. So I went to him and I said, how did that happen? And he said, oh, we were policing the front line in the WTO just recently, just a couple of weeks earlier. I said, and so tell me, how did this happen? And he said, oh, I just had to physically intervene, and my arm got broken. And I said, so tell me, how do you make sure that your people know how to handle that kind of physical confrontation and crisis? He said, well, it's very important you understand what I'm about to say to you, because you must understand that the police force exists in two states: red light on, red light off. Red light on, it's a crisis. The hierarchy is clear, crystal, curtailed. It doesn't explain a lot. It just says do things, and people go off and do them. But it's important that when the red light's off, that you revert to a much more inclusive, discursive leadership style. So then you seek opinions from everyone, juniors as well as more senior people, that you welcome differences of views so that you can just quickly debate it and get something sorted out. I said, so that's like interesting. So there are these two states. He said, that's right. I said, so how do you make sure that people can make that switch? He said, and this was, I thought, really key. He said, we have to make sure that we don't recruit into the police force people who are natural bullies. Because what happens with the bullies is that they love it when the red light's on and they can't turn it off for themselves. They interpret, because we have to be able to bark out orders in a crisis, we better be in that state kind of most of the time. So what you have to do is you have to recruit people who are far more reasonable than that and teach them how to handle the crisis. Don't get the natural bully and try and teach them how to turn the red light off, because they can't do it.
There's quite a lot in there for
Isn't
me. Yeah, and I'm just making notes as we go. And right, that red light on, red light off is something that I recognize, that autocratic to the inclusive kind of mindset. And it's very interesting that if, as an organization, you are running in the red from the position of so many projects going on and they're all critical all the time, then it's that running down a hill and almost we daren't stop kind of scenario because we'll fall over. And then I see people getting into a bit of a panic, and they're trying to, because they're good people trying to do good things. And that's when I notice that people can go into a kind of submissive space. It's better to do as I'm told when there's pandemonium around me, because when this basically all comes out in the wash and questions are asked, well, I was just doing what I was told. And that's when people don't speak truth to power. And what I notice is as well, I mean, yes, bullies love a red light on. I totally buy into that. But I also think, and I'm particularly intrigued because I don't meet, every now and then I'll meet a bully, but generally speaking, I meet good people. But the experience for those around them could be that of being bullied. But that's not where the person's coming from. And I think it's this line that goes driven, motivated, bullish, bully. And there's something about constant drive, never being switched off, can be experienced as bullying by somebody who has no gap for recovery or reflection, or there's very little forgiveness or coaching. So I do think you're right. Yes, if it's very autocratic, very dictatorial, and somebody's enjoying that, big problem. But actually it's when, inverted commas, decent, normal managers, leaders are just working in the red for such a long time, they move into a space that they almost, with self-reflection, if they were watching themselves on TV, they go, oh my God, is that what I'm doing? But they don't see it.
Yes.
And that's when people that's when you start to lose touch with what's going on the ground.
That's quite right.
Because
and I'll tell you this, I've worked with a number of different airlines through my career, half a dozen in fact. And I don't remember which one it was, but there is a thing called cockpit resource management, because if someone's flying when a team of people are flying an aircraft, it is always a team of people. If it's certainly long haul, you can have 4 or 5 pilots, not on the flight deck, but rotating through the flight deck for a really long haul flight. Firstly, there has to be a rule that says, what do you say to everyone else to say that you are in control right now? Don't leave it to implication, but who's got the control of the aircraft right now? And they have to learn to say, I have control. So they have to say it out loud. It's got to be explicit. But the other thing is that if, let's say the captain's in the left-hand seat, which is the command seat, and the captain says, I have control. So that's pretty explicitly, everyone else does as they're told, as it were. But most airlines also, through this process of called cockpit resource management, have taught the juniors how to push back against the captain who has control. And usually there's a form of words that they use. And I don't remember which airline it was, but one of them uses the form of words, Captain, you must listen to this. Has to be said in exactly that form, not just hinted at, but say those exact words in that order. Captain, you must listen to this. Now, if the tragedy happens and everyone's wiped out, it's a kind of Pyrrhic victory if the first officer, the captain, didn't listen. But more often than not, what happens in most airlines is that they have such careful analytics now about how aircraft are flown, and particularly how they're landed, that I know that certainly a number of years ago I was working with British Airways, and they're meticulous about analysing even slightly heavy landings, and they'll analyse everything. and not with the idea of looking at blame, but the idea of learning. It's a really
craft, skill, learn.
Yeah, learning, let's get better at this, because
Yeah.
a heavy landing is not good. It puts wear and tear on the airframe, and who knows, it might be 5 flights down the road where the pigeons come home to roost, as it were. But if on the flight deck recorder in the black box, the words "Captain, you must listen to this" are said, the next action that captain is accountable for. Did they listen to it? Did they consider it? Did they take the appropriate action, or did they not? So in that sense, what the airline have done to keep everybody safe and to keep everybody learning is make sure that there's a form of words that more junior people can say to more senior people, where the culpability then shifts to the senior person to react appropriately.
I'm fascinated by this idea of, in a perfect world, we'd all be of a level. And even though somebody has the positional power, we all feel as if we're surrounded by peers and we can offer anything to anybody, that utopian space, right? But because human beings are, basically, I think, complicated apes, and there's the whole kind of, truisms of how we are, who we are, and all those kind of things. If you make an environment so toothless that everybody has to be listened to all the time about everything, then actually very little happens. But if you drive it because actually it's quicker to the point where it's a complete autocracy, then of course that becomes a dominance and lack of innovation and etc. And so everybody's striving for this sweet spot of balancing that, the ability to have a conversation through to the understanding that now is not the time for one. And getting that right is probably the $64,000 question. And if we come back to that, how do you stay in touch with the ground? Or how does the Queen, she thinks the world smells of paint, right? Because there's somebody 3 meters ahead of her painting the fence, that old analogy. But people generally have a tendency to be cautious, at the very least, around positional power. Yes, at the very least, there's a level of caution. This person might make a career judgment on me. If they think less of me, it wouldn't help my brand. So there's a instinct to present upwards. And I think for me that, I'm going to ask you what that top tip for, if you are in a leadership role, or if actually you're reporting into a leader, how do you offer truth to power, or how do you create the capacity for people to do it? There's something about, and I wrote down a couple of questions here, and one of them is, what don't I know?
Yep.
Or what don't we know?
What am I missing?
Yeah. And when I asked that question, rather like the junior pilot is created a moment where the pilot has to listen, that reverse coming down is, what don't I know? Yeah. Which is another question, is what can hurt us? Or what can hurt, not so much me, what can hurt us and nothing's being done about it?
Yeah.
Where once I've asked that question, if you don't tell me, we've got a problem. Now, that is where you might have to put your big pants on. You may have to go, well, I've had bosses before when you've been honest with them. Yeah, but you're going to have to take a risk. You're going to have to offer a truth. So there is something, I think, about the conscious crafting of good questions with a perceived intent that this is genuine. And you know what, if I've got a bit of a gruff nature, or I'm a little bit, whatever, I don't have to walk around being this, angelic personality. But if it's coming in the process of the organization, that's how we ask questions. That is the expectation, just like the pilot thing. I think that question, what don't I know? What don't we know? Is one of those things that an organization could do a lot worse than put in.
I think that's right, but I'd also urge us, in a sense, if we're going to Bradford, I wouldn't start from here. That if I think what we've got to do is to think about leadership again. When I was a kid, leadership was, John Wayne, single point leadership. The guy who fights all the biggest guys in the opposition camp and always wins. Is always the smart man, and usually man, coming in riding on a big white charger. We've got to put that out of our minds. You know, the world is too complex to believe on single point leadership anymore. But what we've got to understand is that complete leadership is unlikely to be shown by individuals. It might be able to be shown by teams. And if we genuinely believe that absolutely in our hearts, then even if I'm the chief executive, I realize that I am interdependent with my colleagues. And so what is my job as chief executive? Well, it's to make sure that we're doing all the right things, not to do them myself. So it's almost as if the question, you know, what don't I know, in a sense is an anachronism. What I think, and you put it rightly, you said, what do we not know? What are we? What's the key question that we are not asking ourselves? You know, but the language of we and not I really has to be permanently shifted. We've got to think of, it's us, we're leading this, it's this team that leads. And yes, if I'm accountable and if I'm ultimately the boss, all that means is I am the most vulnerable, because if we get this wrong, I lose my job. Yeah. So that when, for example, you know, there's some mistake happens in some organization, you know, you will often hear, you know, the chief exec say, you know, the buck always has to stop with me, you know, this has happened on my watch, I'm responsible. But how often does that person lose their job rather than the guy 3 levels down the organization who actually hit the button, you know, that was the button. So my belief is that we've really got to get our beliefs straight about leadership. If we genuinely believe that leadership is a collective activity, that the likelihood of getting complete leadership from an individual is minimal, and that therefore we'll only get complete leadership from incomplete leaders working well together, then the question, you know, what do I not know, becomes a legacy of history.
I'm almost, you know, in that what do I not know, I'm slightly, you know, you could unpack that question and we could get into lots of things, but what I realize is health and safety. I work with a lot of construction companies, and you know, there is it's not just a permission, there's an expectation that if you're 18, first day on site, you have not so much as much right to, but that you need to understand that if you see a hole and you see somebody walking towards it, it doesn't matter how senior they are, it is an expectation, an obligation, a duty of care that you would call that out. So they very quickly go, it's not about how long you've been here, my friend. That's really driven home very, very quickly. And I think for me, it's when it's a non-tangible, it's not an emotional thing. It's not a behavioral thing. It's a hole in the ground or a task that needs changing. Calling those out are a safe spot. But when we're asking people to call out people's behavior, what they're doing, the impact that they're having, especially if they're high performers or they're seen to have positional power, that's the bit that when I say, you know, what are we not seeing? What do we not know? What do I not know? It's not just in task. I think we're pretty good. Most organizations are pretty good at going, that process isn't working. We need to change it. That's talking. Right. That's the easy bit, I think.
Yes. Of course, the example of being on a building site, you know, with a hole, let's face it, we are human beings before we're anything else, you know.
Yes.
And we have a physical body before we have anything else. So, you know, is it any less likely that the chief exec will break his leg if he falls in the hole than the junior person falling in the hole? No, it's just as likely. You know, in fact, maybe even more so if he's older. You know, but the point is that there are certain kind of base level considerations, and our physical safety is a great leveler. But you know, think about it too. Why can't we create workplaces in which our psychological safety is regarded with the same respect?
That's the way. Yes. Yes. And I think, you know, that's a great place to bring us to a close on this one, because that recognition about what's the narrative here, what are we about as an organization? Yeah, the financials and the commercials, and you know, okay, it can't be a kibbutz, we know that, but actually where can we have drive, performance focus? But actually it's not safe as in your job's safe. It's not safe as in, oh, you can get by doing nothing. It's not that kind of safe. but actually you can say what you need to say. And that will never get you a punishment. That even a raised eyebrow, it's those that it's welcomed, it's valued. And actually, if it causes consternation, if it causes difficult thinking, if it causes complex conversations afterwards, well done for you bringing it up.
Yeah, there's a woman called Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, and she's written a lot about psychological safety. But the great thing about psychological safety is that it's not just a form of being nice to people. I mean, it is being nice to people, but it's not just that. It actually has a totally synergistic benefit for the performance of the team or the organization. It turns out, for example, that if you create psychological safety, people are more likely to take risks, more likely to learn, more likely to be creative, more likely to come up with the kind of wacky suggestion that could cause a breakthrough idea to be offered. So psychological safety, there's something in it for absolutely everyone. Yes. But the key, I think, in all of this, in leadership terms, is to get our egos firmly under control, because it may well mean that you've got to take a suggestion or even a correction from someone who's, so low down in the hierarchy you can barely see the top of their head, from your lofty position. But still, they could have the key. And in a world which is increasingly complex, the likelihood of one person having a monopoly on wisdom is absolutely zip.
So that's it then for me. That says, look, we saw that piece in the news and that rarefied air of somebody not knowing or saying that they didn't know, so let's just presume, or being shocked and horrified by it. But actually then there's something that says, if you aim for, to create, to demand, to expect, whatever it is, an environment, a culture, a team, a dynamic of psychological safety, and don't confuse that with lack of performance. It's actually, if you want to have the real conversations, the genuine conversations, the tough conversation, all those things you say you want, rather than do it from a position of bravery, as in we've always, you've got to take you've got to get yourself ready for it. It could be a tough one, but actually, no, it will be a tough conversation, but we get to save our energy for that, not having to get through the fear of bringing it to the table. Yeah, then right. Actually those kind of things will dissipate. And it actually, as you say, then it's not just this one topic that then starts to impact on a whole load of other things. Absolutely. Because you can bring it to the table.
The interdependency point, I think, for me is key. You talked about this idea of speaking truth to power. That was an epithet that was given to the relationship between senior civil servants and ministers in government. That was when that term was coined. And of course, there is total interdependency. The minister can set policy, but nothing happens unless the civil servants get behind the policy decision that the minister announces. And if the civil servants believe that the minister is embarking on a course of action which in the long term is likely to be difficult or even inappropriate, it's important for the civil servants to be able to speak truth to power. Not surprisingly, some of those permanent secretaries and so on are rewarded with knighthoods and ultimately peerages because they have spent an awful lot of time with very powerful people who are afraid of constantly being dumped out of power by the electorate, and still being able to speak truth to them and get things done.
Captain, you must listen to this, right?
You must listen to this.
Well, listen, on that note, great conversation. I think what I'm enjoying about these things is when we do these conversations, David, is, sometimes we're reinforcing what we think, but just I think this is a demonstration of actually what leaders and people in roles of developing leaders can really get that value from. It's not always about offering a 5-point checklist of what you should do. It's having the conversation to bring it into your consciousness. So it's something that we're thinking about or talking about, and just having it in your mind means then that actually, if you see leadership as a craft, which you and I do, you'll start to do something about it. And I think that's what these conversations are. And whenever we react to something that we see in the press or whatever, in these DGC sessions, it's not that we're trying to solve it, but I think us having the conversation gives us that clarity, or it reinforces what we think, and that's what we're trying to offer out to people. So I hope that's what they're getting from it.
On it. You can lead the moment you accept that if you see something that's wrong, you should fix it.
Yeah. Okay, good. On that note, sir, I'm going to press the stop button.